Welcome to this month's Power Hour. My name is Chris Jongsma, and I'm one of the training developers for Standard Motor Products. The topic for our session today will be covering various tips and service procedures for electronic parking brake systems and the components within them. Now, these parking brake actuators and the systems that control them bring about some new features and also difficulties to understand. So with our time together, we want to bring some clarity to all of these things. With that being said, I'm excited to walk you through some key pieces of information to consider when operating and servicing these systems. So let's move on over to the shop. So now if we take a look at the rear brakes of many late model vehicles today, we're going to see some obvious differences in comparison to what we used to have. And a lot of these revolve around the addition of electronic parking brake actuators. So now these actuators are typically bolted to the back side of a rear brake caliper, or additionally, you may even see them on the rear of drum style brakes. So rather than having a hydraulic wheel cylinder back there, we could actually have an electronic actuator running those style brakes as well. I've actually personally experienced this myself on a handful of Super Duty pickups. So let's transition over to this chart that we have to show you that actually shows us exactly how quickly these actuators have actually been implemented on vehicles. You can see that from 2010 on up, basically, all of a sudden, most every vehicle is equipped with an electronic parking brake actuator on the rear brakes now. And so along with this comes a variety of buttons and various warning lights that may pop up on our instrument cluster. And a lot of these we may not be that familiar with. And so we hope to kind of cover that a little bit in today's session and bring a little bit more light to these topics, such as the picture on the left-hand side where we've got the parking brake switch, and then right next to it, we've got a switch called the brake hold switch. And so if we take a look at what the brake hold switch does, we've got another slide kind of actually showing us exactly what's going on here. Now, one thing we want to point out is this is going to be different from one manufacturer to another. And so the way this kind of works is if a vehicle is equipped with a brake hold option, the electronic parking brake actuators might be used to hold the vehicle in place in some instances. Now on other vehicles, the way that it is, with the example of a vehicle that we've got in the shop today that we're actually going to be looking at, would be the situation of this Toyota Venza. And so with this application, that brake hold switch, if we actually press on that brake hold switch, then what it's going to do is all of the conditions have to be correct for this to actually operate. We're going to have to be in a drive mode. We're going to have the doors closed, the vehicle in gear. We've got to have our seatbelt actually fastened. Once we hit this brake hold button, this would be used for things like going through a drive-through where I don't want to have my foot on the brake all of the time or stop and go driving. So either one of these situations would be a great example of when we would use that. Now, when we are going to do that on a Toyota, it's going to apply the hydraulic brakes. It's actually not going to use the electronic parking brake actuator until we hit a certain time limit. The Honda is quite similar. If we look at this chart that we've actually got on the screen, this is for a Honda vehicle. And so the switch is put on, the vehicle's driven to a stop, and then once they've done that, all of a sudden you can see that the brakes are applied, even though we're not actually applying the brakes. And so we can come to a stop, and once we've let off, the vehicle's held in place. And after a certain time period, so with the situation of our Toyota, it's going to be somewhere around 3 minutes. Once it sees, okay, you're still in gear, we have not moved, and it's been 3 minutes, it's going to say, I'm going to apply these electronic parking brake actuators to hold us in place. A very similar situation will happen with the Honda, but it may be a longer time base, so it might be somewhere around the 10-minute mark. Some of the key differences that we're going to see with the electronic parking brake actuated systems in reference to mechanical parking brake systems we're going to see fewer mechanical components all across the board. We don't have our cables in place anymore. We don't have a lot of the things that we're adjusting or anything like that, because now we've just got an electronic actuator in place. So with kind of the simplification of the system, we also have now reduced the maintenance. We're not adjusting things as much. We also have automatic application at times. So when we actually start the vehicle up or when we shut the vehicle off, a lot of the time you're going to see a red parking brake indicator on the instrument cluster, basically showing us that this vehicle has the electronic parking brake actually applied when we are stopped, and everything is going to be out of gear, we're in park, and we're ready to park it. So then it's going to apply those brakes for us. Or we also have it integrated with various other systems. And I would say this is one of the key points to consider. So with this, we actually have this electronic parking brake system integrated with many other systems on the vehicle. And we're going to see this kind of across the board with so many different systems, is the integration of various components and systems, and they all are going to be interacting, giving inputs to each other, and then making decisions based off of that. So now we're going to include the ABS, traction and control, and ADAS systems, all with the electronic parking brake and actuators. And what we can do now is actually make some commands. And here's an example right here from a Ford vehicle. And this is just one of the many examples. Other manufacturers are obviously out there with a very similar layout. And so this kind of paints a good picture for us of what we may see of, okay, we've got an ABS module. It's going to be looking at various wheel speeds, and it's going to make some decisions off of that, or with certain brake inputs, or to the point that we just made with the brake hold switch. That would be another good example of, okay, it actually sees this information and it can share it with other modules. And now we can make some decisions of, do we want to apply the brakes right now? Or do we want to do something else of releasing or anything, of setting diagnostic trouble codes because we've got a failure? And so with all of these being so integrated, now we can actually make a lot more decisions when we're driving the vehicle. To kind of zoom in a little bit and go from the full vehicle-wide view of what every module and system looks like on there, we're now kind of transitioning over a little bit, and we're looking at essentially almost every layout is going to be very similar to this setup. Again, we're working on a Toyota in the shop, so I kind of want to keep everything based on that, just so we know that, okay, this is going to be what we're actually looking at. And so the actuator that we're going to kind of dig into a little bit further when we get hands-on is going to be this setup right here, where we're going to have what we call a skid control ECU, or essentially the ABS module. Then it's going to control the power and ground supply to each rear brake actuator. So you'll see that there is not a constant ground fed to one of these actuators or a constant power feed. We do have the fused power going to the module, and we have a ground supply, but then the actuators are actually controlled high and low from the module. One of the reasons why is, if we think about, we've got to be able to apply the parking brake actuator, and we have to release it, which means that we're going to have to reverse how this motor actually spins. We're going to have to, spin the gear to it and actually apply the caliper, other times release. And so because of this, we need to control both ways, and we're going to change that polarity, and we're going to apply voltage, or vice versa. So with that, now we've got a little bit better look at kind of how those are controlled on the vehicle. And one other thing I want to kind of touch base on kind of before we move over into the vehicle diagnostics and looking into the servicing the brakes on this vehicle, is we need to consider if we have the required tools for a rear brake job now, where we are used to having just kind of standard tools. I may have a C-clamp hanging from my toolbox, or I may have a tool like we've got shown here, where we're going to actually just ratchet it, and then it's going to press the caliper piston back into the caliper. And once we've done that, then we can go ahead, replace the brake rotor and brake pads, take care of the rear brake job. if we attempt to do something like that with a vehicle with electronic parking brakes, and we have done nothing to address, putting it into any type of a maintenance or service mode, we can do severe damage to many different things on the vehicle. We could affect a brake caliper, we could damage the actuators, or we can actually have other things set diagnostic trouble codes or damage other things because it saw a pressure change or it saw a movement. So if we don't make sure that we put this thing in the correct service or maintenance mode prior to doing the work and we don't follow service information, we could definitely cause damage to multiple components. And this is something we want to avoid. So with that in mind, I've got kind of a picture of what type of vehicle we're going to be looking at in the shop today. And luckily we've got one on the hoist right nearby here. And so we're going to transition over there in just a minute. And the layout that is going to be worked on is a Toyota Venza hybrid. And we've got roughly about 40,000 miles on the vehicle. And what I want to lay out though is putting the vehicle into maintenance mode for servicing the rear brakes and what it looks like when we service the brakes on the vehicle, or at least trying to pull an actuator off of there. There's going to be two different modes that we can do when servicing the rear brakes, and the first one is going to be manual mode. And so first I'm going to lay out by looking at the slides of what it takes to put this in maintenance mode, both manual or if we've actually going to do it with a scan tool. And so with manual mode, it's a series of key off, key on this vehicle, and it's very similar premise on other makes, but it could kind of vary here or there. So we've got to be a little bit careful, and we don't want to assume anything because it is going to change from one vehicle to another. So again, on this one, we're going to do key off, then we're going to do key on. Now within the time frame of 8 seconds, we have to pull up on that parking brake switch. So if we kind of look back and we remember the parking brake switch picture that I showed you at the beginning, in order to apply that parking brake, we're going to actually pull up on that. And so we're going to pull 3 times on the switch. Then we are going to push down on it, which would be a release function. We're going to do that 3 times. Now our parking brake indicator is going to be flashing really quickly at us. After that, we know that we're starting to make progress in our reset procedure. Now is when we're going to push and hold down on the parking brake switch and release it, but we have to hold it down for 5 seconds or longer, and then we're going to see that light change. So once it goes from a fast flash to just more of a kind of a slow, steady flash, now we know that we're in maintenance mode and we're ready to service the vehicle. So we can turn the key off, and we're also at the same time, you'll see when we get on the vehicle, but I want you to listen really closely to what happens when we get it into maintenance mode, because when you actually hopefully can hear it on our microphones, you're going to hear how the parking brake will kind of actuate on a normal basis even when we turn the vehicle on or turn it off. But when we put it into maintenance mode, you're going to hear those calipers run back for quite a while with the actuator driving that function. And so the actuator is going to retract that caliper all of the way back, or I should say the rod internal to it, so then you can service the brakes. And so we want to hear that noise of the retracting brakes at the same time of actually doing the function. So with that in mind, I'm going to make my way over to the vehicle, and we're just going to leave this screen on for a second while I make my way over, and then we're going to hop in and we're going to actually attempt the maintenance mode by manual method first, and then after that we're going to go into the scan tool method. So first we're going to start off with the manual method, and we'll begin right now. So now what we're going to do is key up the vehicle, and right away we're going to put our foot on the brake, apply the parking brake 3 times, so pull up on the switch, then we're going to press down on the switch to release it 3 times. All of this has to happen in the matter of about 8 seconds, and then we're going to long hold the parking brake switch, which is going to give us a flashing park indicator. We've got the flashing indicator, and now we're going to long hold the switch. And now we can hear the brake release. After that, we're in service mode, and we're going to see a slow flash of the park light, and that indicates that we're in service mode. We can key the vehicle off and service the rear brakes. Okay, so now that we've actually got the rear brakes in service mode manually, the other thing I want to cover is some of these service mode warnings that we may encounter whenever we put in service mode. And that would be that sometimes if we don't actually get in service mode all of the way, we can have possible injury from these things applying at a time that we don't want them to, or we can have diagnostic trouble codes set once we've put it into service mode. And the other method that I want to walk through today is actually applying it and putting it into service mode with the scan tool. And so we've got a scan tool already hooked up to a HDMI cable for your viewing, and we've got the vehicle keyed up. And so we're going to actually place the vehicle into maintenance mode. I want to walk you through all those steps with the scan tool. And this is how we're going to end up servicing the rear brakes on this vehicle today, is by using the scan tool. And once we've got it into maintenance mode, we'll continue with our hands-on application. So let's now look at the Autel and work our way through the screens here. All right, so now we've already walked you through what some of the features look like interior to the vehicle, of some of the warning lights we're going to see for the system, or some of the buttons that we're going to be able to press or release for parking brake application, or the brake hold function that we already kind of covered as well. Now, the next thing we want to do, since we've already gone through the manual release method with the buttons interior to the vehicle, I want to show you on the scan tool of how we'll actually enter the brake release mode through the scan tool. So we've already ID'd the vehicle with our Autel scan tool, and we're going to actually go through this. And the reason why I kind of point out what scan tool we're using is only because the functions may look a little bit different depending on what scan tool we're using as to, where we've got to choose the function that we're going through. So here, what I'm going to do is choose control unit. This is going to then basically show me all the modules on the vehicle. And I'm going to go to the brake module, or electronic parking brake. And you can see it's highlighted already. I've been through here, and it's a little bit easier for you to see now exactly the path that we're going to take to release the brakes according to service information. So I'm going to select the brake/EPB. And now it says what it controls, what is actually the function to this module. And so we're going to say OK. Now we've got a selection to make. We can either choose special function, look at data in the module, or active test. Here's where we're going to go through special functions, and this is going to look very similar on any scan tool that we've got. And now you can see again, highlighted in blue, a couple of the functions we could choose to do something with electronic parking brakes. And so if you look at the service information that we already went through the steps of, we're going to choose the electronic parking brake full release. Now, if you look at the bottom, it says replace brake pads. That is another option. And basically what it's doing is it walks you through the process and is going to do the exact same thing. So we're going to now choose electronic parking brake full release. And it tells us this is how it's going to release the actuators on the rear brakes for service. We're going to see a series of warnings here, and this is something to really pay attention to. As I was just trying this earlier actually, and I was wondering why it wasn't releasing when I selected this function. And what we ran into is you have to follow all of the steps, and one of those is that the electronic parking brake needs to be released prior to actually doing this function. And since we're in park, the vehicle's not in gear, and it's just keyed up, the electronic parking brake by default is actually going to be on. So first I have to release that by putting my foot on the brake and then selecting the release button in the middle of the console. And now I'm going to say next. So now we're going to select next, and we should hear the rear parking brake actuators fully release and retract back through the caliper. You may notice, hopefully you could hear that okay coming through the microphone, but with that release also, that's not your typical release where they kind of retract just enough to get off of the brake caliper or off of the drum if it's, parking brake where it's a drum brake style. And so when we actually put it into service mode, you can tell that that threaded rod that's interior to there and the actuator that's retracting it actually has to go for a long time before it finally seats fully away from the brakes, and that now we can actually service the brakes. So at this point, it's confirmed and it says that it has completed. At this point, we can exit out of here and it is ready to be serviced. We can key the vehicle off. We're gonna unplug things if we need to, following service information again, and now we can go through the rest of our service procedure. So now, as we said, in the car, we're gonna go check for trouble codes. I've got the scan tool here, and we're going to look for trouble codes in the module, make sure there are none. And here, we don't have any. If I did set any trouble codes, which can happen, then we're gonna go through, clear them, and see if they return after that. So I'm gonna actually utilize the system, see if they return. If so, we may have a fault or maybe something hasn't really been followed properly, and then we would have to do further diagnosis. So now that we've got it placed in service mode, and again, it doesn't matter what way we've got the rear brakes into that maintenance mode, it could be either with manual or scan tool. We happen to choose scan tool at this time. We want to actually go to that caliper assembly with the actuator on there, and we're going to actually look at some methods of determining if it's actually applied or if we're in maintenance mode. So why don't we get on the vehicle right now and take a look at some tips on how to perform that check. After the vehicle's been placed in maintenance mode for the rear brakes, we're going to want to do a few different things in order to remove an actuator or service brakes. And one of those things is going to be, I want to actually spin the rear brake rotor just to be sure that the electronic e-brake is not actually applied. So we'll do that, verify that it can spin. After that, we're going to disconnect the electrical connector back here. And you can see that we have the 2-wire connector that we're talking about in the PowerPoint of today's presentation. And the other thing is there's 2 mounting bolts here on the actuator. We're going to take those bolts out of the actuator, and you're going to find that sometimes you have to actually kind of move the actuator a little bit because there is a gear on it. And from this point, to simplicity's sake of showing you and explaining the system, we're actually going to go back to the workbench now so you can actually see what that actuator looks like a little closer and with a little better shot on it. So why don't we get back to the workbench and we'll take a closer look at that actuator. We've got one of these actuators on the bench, and as we take a closer look, you can kind of see that gear that is internal to it. And so this gear is actually going to drive the physical portion, the rod that's interior to the caliper, and that's going to be what's retracting or applying the brake. And this is a good look at what that looks like. And now you can kind of see why we've got to clock this actuator at times also to get everything lined up and the bolt holes actually set up. You can also see this surface here. This is critical for mounting, where we need to have a clean surface on the caliper, clean surface here, and then that O-ring that we talked about earlier on, that is going to be replaced and lubed properly for a clean install here, so we don't have any corrosion issues or any failures that are premature because of installation errors. So with that, hopefully you can see a little bit better of what that gearing looks like and what the mounting surface is to the actuator and why it's so critical that especially in my climate. I come from a state where it gets hot and cold frequently. And so if anyone else can relate to that too, we've got to make sure that this system is sealed up properly. And the only way to address all of these concerns is to make sure that we follow that information and that we, make sure that we line the gearing up properly, bolt it up, and that everything's clean. That includes the caliper and the O-ring, that we've got a new O-ring and a lightly lubed O-ring with the proper lubrication as well. Then we're going to install that the way that we explained during the video today. And so now with that, hopefully that gives you a little bit better understanding of how we're going to do that process. So as we move away from the vehicle, and I want to kind of show you on the screen here again of a little bit closer view of that caliper, since we didn't actually take the actuator off for you to see because it's so tight and we're kind of short on time here. So this screen does a good job of showing what the back of the caliper looks like for the gear that's driven by the actuator. And this kind of also displays why it's so important that seal's got to be clean, the mounting surface has also got to be clean to accept that actuator, and that we're not going to have any corrosion issues, or we're not going to have any intrusion of any weather or anything like that into this, and that we've got a fault-free installation of a parking brake actuator or just the rear brakes if we're doing anything with servicing the brakes in general even. And again, looking at those mounting bolts, if we're talking about that, here's kind of a good close-up view again of I'm going to take those bolts out like we said, and I can turn that a little bit. But my big thing I want to show also is, let's say we've got that caliper off and I'm looking at the right side of the screen here. We can see that on this Toyota, we have a solid caliper piston. And so if we're going by assumptions, I would look at that and I would just press it back with my trusty C-clamp or a brake depressing tool, something like this. But if we do that and we don't put it into one of those service modes that we just showed, that's where we're going to run into damaging of the caliper. And it's going to look something like this, where this caliper on the right hand side here was not placed in service mode. There was actually a time where the brakes did try to apply. Again, those modules are looking at this information and it's analyzing what's going on. If we all of a sudden start pushing this thing back, it may say, hey, my clearance isn't right and I'm going to apply the brakes. And so this is going to be where we could definitely run into that scenario of injury to ourselves or damaging various components on the vehicle. Now, again, just that last tech tip of making sure that everything is clean. If we don't verify some of these things or place it into that service mode, that's where we're going to run into issues. And so that's kind of the theme of everything today really is that we don't have a whole lot of time to cover everything, but I really want to make sure that we're being safe with our servicing of the system. I want you to understand a little bit about the control and what all components are involved with this process. And again, we don't have a whole lot of time to cover everything today, but I want to make sure that we continue on with our education also with this. And so some of our various resources are going to be on YouTube, where we've got our standard brand channel and we can go there. We're going to see some short videos, and we also have our standard brand training too, with full-length classes on various topics. And this is going to be one that will be coming up in the future. Also, we've got our product lines too on our website, and you can view these. And so you can see we've got a lot of electronic actuators for rear brakes at this time already. And so with that information, pretty much wraps up my end of the presentation. However, Corey, do you have some questions at all from the crowd?
You know what, Chris, actually we do. I've answered quite a few back here in the background, but things are happening so fast here. We want to make sure we get the right questions out and everybody gets something answered here. So we got a few though I want to highlight in the spirit of time to make sure we get answered for everybody though.
Sure.
One is, what do I do if I have a parking brake warning light on after servicing the rear brakes on a vehicle with the EPB, the electronic parking brakes?
Yeah, good question. So if we have a warning light after we service it, there would be a couple of things I'd want to do. I would want to scan for trouble codes right away. Those are going to give me some direction. If they clear out, I might be able to go back, make sure that I apply the parking brake after that, which there is going to be a process to getting those seated back up properly. And so again, that goes back to service information of what's the process to get this back seated the way it's supposed to, and kind of set that home position for the electronic parking brake. And then once I've got that in place, now that's all set, and we're going to want to check for operation and trouble codes. So I would say my first step would be checking for DTCs and then kind of working my way back through service information.
All right. This one I think is a really good one, and I'm sure a lot of people are asking, but we've only had it asked about 3 times today. So how do I know what functions are operated by the parking brake actuators or by the hydraulic brakes on the vehicle? How do I know which is which?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. We kind of touched base on it just a little bit at the beginning of the scenario of the brake hold switch just being one of those things. There are other functions that may be operated on that particular vehicle. So I would actually start off by going to the owner's manual, which a lot of the time we can find online through our manufacturer. So with this Toyota, I would probably go to the manufacturer website and then go to the owner's manual, and I can look up those functions and it may tell me there. Now, if I'm a technician and I'm looking to service it or understanding description and operation better, then I might go there and get a really good understanding of what all is controlled, how is it operated. So there's 2 different sources that I can think of to kind of gain a better understanding of that.
All right. I'm going to throw one more out there because you actually brought up the weather being hot and cold and things like that. I'm assuming this person is probably from a colder climate because the question is, can weather or corrosion affect parking brake actuators? And I'm thinking road brine and salt here when I'm seeing that question.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've experienced many of these things. I come from a climate where I run into this kind of stuff, and absolutely. And again, that kind of goes back to why it's so paramount to do some of the steps that we kind of laid out in today's video of what did I do on the vehicle when we got to the actuator servicing the rear brakes. Well, we've got to make sure everything is crystal clean when we're actually installing those things. If it's not, that's where we're going to introduce things that we don't want into the rear brakes. Now, that's not just the actuator either. I mean, we could get some of that passed and get it to the caliper, things that we don't want either. Any of this stuff can be compromised. And again, that's why that replacing the seal, if our new actuator comes with replacement bolts, a lot of our actuators may come with a seal and bolts. In that case, we're going to do all of those items. So again, yes, make sure that all of our mounting surfaces are very clean, and then we're going to put it together properly according to what we're told by service information.
All right, Chris. Well, again, in the spirit of time, I'm going to keep it to those there and just say thank you to everybody that joined us today. Thank you, Chris, for spending some time with us, and I'll let you take us out.
Yeah, thank you everyone very much for attending today's session, and I hope you learned a little bit more about electronic parking brake actuators and the systems that control them.